Have you ever paused in your day, maybe watching clouds change shape, or seeing a plant grow, or just, feeling time pass, and really wondered, is all this constant change, this flux, is it actually real?
Well, maybe is there something deeper, something unchanging underneath it all? A reality our senses just don't pick up on.
Exactly. What if everything we think we know about how things move, how they change, how there are many things,
Hmm.
what if it's all just, well, a grand illusion?
It's a huge question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Goes right to the heart of what it means to be. And for one particular ancient Greek philosopher, the answer was a definite and pretty radical yes. What we see, what we hear, mostly illusion, just appearance.
Absolutely. Today we're doing a deep dive into the revolutionary ideas of Parmenides of Elea. And this guy didn't just question reality, he fundamentally attacked the very foundations of how people understood it back then.
Yeah, this isn't just dusting off an old history book. We're trying to understand the very beginnings of Western metaphysics, this core concept of being.
Right. Our mission today is to really get into his, frankly, wild concepts of being. I want to unpack the logic he used because he was very logical to argue against change and multiplicity.
And we need to see how his ideas became such a crucial turning point for all of Western philosophy that followed. We'll also place him in his time, the whole pre-Socratic scene, see how he built on some ideas but dramatically broke away from others.
And for this deep dive, we're drawing on the sources we have, those fascinating, kind of tricky fragments of his main work on nature.
Plus, yeah, we're looking at historical analysis, philosophical commentary, stuff that helps us piece together his life, his school of thought, and why he still matters. So listener, get ready. This might shake up how you think about, well, everything.
Okay, so let's start with the man, Parmenides. Who was he? We're talking late 6th, early 5th century BCE. A long, long time ago.
A very long time ago. He was from Ilia. Now, Ilia was a Greek colony, but it was over in Magna Graecia, that's southern Italy today.
So not mainland Greece.
Right, and Ilia wasn't some backwater. It was on major trade routes. Think bustling port city, lots of different cultures interacting, exchanging goods, and importantly, ideas.
Ah, so a real melting pot.
Exactly, which made it intellectually really dynamic. It was a place where new, maybe even radical ideas could sprout up more easily than in, say, Athens or Sparta with their more established traditions, less constrained.
That makes sense. A kind of philosophical frontier town, maybe? And Parmenides himself, he wasn't just sitting around thinking all day, was he? Sounds like he was actually involved in the city.
That's a key point, yeah. He probably came from a wealthy aristocratic family. That gave him the education, the time, the resources for philosophy. But the sources we have, later biographies mostly, suggest he was a real leader in Alia.
Like in politics.
Yeah, politics, social leadership. There are even reports he helped establish or regulate the city's laws. So he wasn't just an ivory tower thinker, he was shaping the actual reality of his community, too.
A philosopher-statesman. That's quite a combination.
It really is. It suggests someone trying to connect deep thought with practical life, which is fascinating.
Okay, so that's the man in his city. What about the bigger picture? This pre-Socratic period, what was going on? It sounds like a time of huge intellectual upheaval.
Oh, it was an absolute revolution in thought. The 6th and 5th centuries BCE, this whole pre-Socratic era, it marks this massive shift in ancient Greece.
From what to what?
Well, before this, explanations for how the world worked, the cosmos, why things happen, it was all mostly mythology. Stories about gods, divine actions, epic narratives.
Right, Zeus throwing thunderbolts, that kind of thing.
Exactly. But during the pre-Socratic period, thinkers started moving away from mythos, those stories, towards logos. They started looking for rational explanations, using reason, observation, logic to understand nature, the universe, human existence itself.
So the birth of rational thought, basically, like early science and philosophy all mixed together.
That's a great way to put it. It was a very beginning of trying to understand the world through systematic inquiry, laying the groundwork for both science and philosophy as we know them, though they weren't really separate fields back then.
Were there big events happening that pushed this along? Wars, maybe?
Definitely. The Persian Wars were huge. They spanned the early 5th century BCE, roughly 499 to 449. Massive conflict.
Against the Persian Empire.
Right. And while incredibly destructive, these wars kind of forced the Greek city-states to band together to define who they were against this huge external threat. It spurred innovation, a lot of deep thinking about their identity, their place in the world.
A sort of us versus them that made them think harder about us.
Kind of, yeah. And this intense intellectual energy spilled over into philosophy. It accelerated the spread of ideas, pushed thinkers to question fundamental assumptions about reality, about knowledge.
And back to Alea for a second, you said these colony cities had more freedom. How exactly did that help someone like Parmenides with his really out there ideas?
It was critical. Mainland Greece, the older cities, they often had strong traditions, established religious views, maybe more social pressure to conform. Colonies like Elea were newer, often more diverse, less bound by those old constraints.
So more room to think differently.
Exactly. There was an environment where radical ideas, things that might seem weird or even offensive to traditionalists, could actually be developed, discussed, debated openly without being immediately shut down. For Parmenides, whose ideas, as we'll see, really went against the grain of common sense, that intellectual space was absolutely essential.
Okay, so we have this picture. Influential guy, dynamic city, revolutionary times. And he pours all this into his big work on nature. Periphysios. What was it like?
Well, first off, it was a poem, a didactic poem, meaning it was meant to teach, to explain. That was a common, respected format for philosophy back then. Not a dry textbook, more like, well, a philosophical epic, maybe.
Interesting, a poem to explain reality.
Yeah, often quite symbolic, allegorical. And it's structured in three main parts. There's the proem, the introduction. It often describes this kind of mystical journey, like the philosopher being guided by a goddess towards truth.
Okay, setting the scene.
Then the really crucial part, the path of truth, aletheia. This is the core of his system, where he lays out his logical arguments about what reality really is.
The main event.
Exactly. And finally, there's the path of opinion, doxa. This section discusses the world we perceive through our senses, our everyday beliefs. The world, Parmenides argues, is basically flawed, misleading.
So truth versus opinion, reason versus senses. That structure itself says a lot. But didn't you say we only have fragments? That must make it hard to study.
It does present challenges, definitely. The whole poem hasn't survived. Time, accidents of history, things get lost. What we have are bits and pieces, quotations preserved by later thinkers.
Like who?
Really important figures, thankfully. Plato quotes him and argues with him in his dialogues. Aristotle analyzed his ideas when cataloging earlier philosophies. And later commentators, like Simplicius, quoted chunks of the poem.
So we're seeing Parmenides through the eyes of those who came after him.
Largely, yes. But the fragments we do have are remarkably coherent, surprisingly rich. Scholars can piece together his main arguments pretty clearly. It's like having key pieces of a mosaic enough to see the picture, and the power of his logic really shines through.
Okay, let's dive into that picture then. The core of it all, being. You said his main idea here was super radical. What was it?
At its absolute heart, Parmenides' philosophy is about ontology, the study of being itself, existence. And his foundational statement, the bedrock of everything, sounds simple, but it's explosive. It's what is, what is not, is not.
What is what is not, is not. Okay,
Yeah.
that sounds obvious. Like a thing is what it is and it's not what it isn't. Why is that the cornerstone of Western metaphysics?
Because Parmenides takes that seemingly obvious statement and follows its logical consequences with ruthless consistency. The crucial part is the second half. What is not is not. He argues that what is not, non-being, nothingness, cannot be thought, cannot be spoken of, cannot exist in any way whatsoever.
You can't even think about nothing.
Not meaningfully, no, because the moment you try to think about nothing, you're treating it as something your thought is directed towards. You're giving it a kind of conceptual being. So for Parmenides, what is not is literally unthinkable, unspeakable, impossible, full stop.
Wow, okay, that's not just wordplay then. It's a logical absolute for him.
Exactly. And that seemingly simple premise absolutely demolishes our common sense understanding of the world. It becomes the foundation for everything else he argues, and it forced philosophers for centuries after him to rethink existence itself.
And this must be why he distrusted the senses so much,
Yeah.
right? Because our senses constantly show us things, changing things, becoming what they were not, or ceasing to be what they were. That involves not being, doesn't it?
Precisely. That's the radical leap. Our senses bombard us with change, motion, the appearance of many different things. But Parmenides says, hold on, if what is not is impossible, then change itself must be impossible. Because change implies something going from being X to not being X, or coming into being from not being.
So seeing a seed grow into a tree and then die, that whole process relies on not being creeping in.
Logically, yes. According to Parmenides, it implies states of not being a seed and not being a tree. So he insists true reality, the ultimate truth, can only be grasped by pure reason, by the logos. Our senses are just showing us a deceptive show.
So my entire experience of life, watching things grow, move, decay, that's just an illusion. That's a staggering claim.
It is absolutely staggering, and that's exactly his conclusion. Change, multiplicity, the idea that there are many separate things, motion, none of it is ultimately real. They are illusions produced by our faulty senses.
So what is real then, according to him? What's the universe actually like?
His vision is completely counterintuitive. He says reality, or being, is a single, unchanging, indivisible, motionless, eternal whole. One solid block of isness, essentially. It challenges everything we experience.
Don't believe your eyes, believe your logic.
That's pretty much it. He's prioritizing logical consistency above all else.
Yeah.
That analogy you mentioned, the movie screen, really helps here, I think.
Yeah, explain that again.
Okay, think about watching a film. On the screen, you see people moving, scenes changing, things happening, constant flux, right? But the screen itself, it doesn't change. It's just one static, continuous surface.
Right. The images move, but the screen stays put.
So for Parmenides, our senses show us the movie, all the apparent change, movement, the story unfolding. But reason, logos, looks past the movie and sees the unchanging screen, the single, eternal, underlying reality of being. The movie is compelling, but it's not the truth of the screen itself.
That's a really helpful way to think about it. It makes that leap from logic to this bizarre reality seem, well, almost understandable. And this big distinction, it leads to his two paths, right? Truth versus opinion, aletheia versus doxa.
Exactly. The path of truth, aletheia, is the path of reason. This is where he lays out the real nature of being deduced logically.
Based on that core idea, what is, what is not, is not.
Precisely. The key assertion is you can only think about, talk about, or know what is. Trying to think about what is not is like trying to grab smoke. It's a conceptual void, a logical dead end. Any meaningful thought has to be about something that is.
And from that starting point, he logically derives all those characteristics of being that sound so strange to us. What were they again?
Okay, let's tick them off. First, being is unchanging. It can't come into existence because that would mean it came from not being, and it can't cease to exist because that would mean it goes into not being. So it must be eternal, constant, no beginning, no end.
Timeless.
Second, it's indivisible. It's a single, continuous whole. You can't break it into parts because what would separate the parts? Not being, but that doesn't exist. So there can be no gaps, no divisions. It's a perfect plenum, completely full.
A seamless whole.
Yeah.
Makes sense if there's nothing to divide it. What about movement?
Third, motionless. Being cannot move. Why? Because movement implies going from one place where it is to another place where it presumably is not yet, or moving through empty space, not being. Since not being is impossible, motion is impossible. It's static.
Whoa. So me just waving my hand is an illusion.
Logically, for Parmenides, yes, that perceived motion can't be fundamentally real. Which leads to the fourth point. Being is one. There's no multiplicity. If there were many things that have to be separated by something, again, not being. Since that's impossible, reality must be a single, unified whole, not lots of separate bits.
One, unchanging, indivisible, motionless. Anything else?
Fifth, it's often described as finite and complete, but sometimes as infinite or boundless in a specific sense. Parmenides uses the image of a sphere, not literally a ball, but something perfectly complete, uniform, lacking nothing, equally real in all directions. It's not limited by space or time in the sense of having an edge with nothing beyond it. It just is, completely and perfectly everywhere it is.
Wow. Okay. That is a radically different picture of reality, built entirely on logic. And that tool he used, this principle of non-contradiction, seems like the key to the whole thing.
It absolutely is the key. Parmenides was revolutionary because he was one of the first to really weaponize logic like this. He systematically applied the principle of non-contradiction, something cannot be and not be at the same time in the same way.
It's obvious now, maybe.
It does, but he built his entire system on its absolute necessity. He showed that if you accept non-contradiction, then concepts like change, motion, multiplicity, and especially not being lead to logical contradictions. They become as impossible as a round square. This systematic deductive method, starting from a basic logical principle and following it relentlessly, that's what makes him so foundational for philosophy. He's showing how to do philosophy rigorously.
So just to hammer this home, for Parmenides, change and all that, it's not just hard to understand, it's logically impossible. It's an illusion created by our senses which violate logic. True reality is this single, static, unified being, and only reason can grasp it.
That's the core message of the path of truth. The intellect, the logos, is the only reliable guide. Senses. They give us a vivid show, but it's fundamentally deceptive. It's seeming, not being.
Okay, so what about the other path, the path of opinion, doxa? That's the path of the senses, right? The one he says is wrong.
Exactly. Doxa represents how we normally experience the world through seeing, hearing, touching, and the common beliefs we form based on that sensory input. Parmenides says this whole path is fundamentally flawed, misleading, unreliable.
Why? Because the senses just keep showing us impossible things, like change and multiplicity.
Precisely. Our senses present a world buzzing with movement, transformation, lots of different objects interacting. But from the perspective of reason, as established on the path of truth, this sensory world simply cannot be the true reality because it's riddled with logical contradictions involving not being.
So me watching a flower bloom and then wilt. Just my senses playing tricks on me, showing me things that logically can't happen.
According to Parmenides' strict logic, yes. Those perceived processes are appearances, not the underlying reality of unchanging being. And importantly, the doxa section isn't just about direct perception. It also includes, for Parmenides, all the attempts by other philosophers or by myth-makers to explain the universe based on observation.
Like the theories of Thales or Heraclitus.
Exactly. He'd see those as mere opinions, too, because they start from sensory data and assume the reality of change and multiplicity, which his path of truth has already shown to be logically incoherent. They are stuck on the wrong path, the path of seeming.
So he really establishes this sharp divide.
Mm-hmm.
Pure logic on one side, sensory experience and resulting opinions on the other. And his revolutionary logical method is what allows him to make that cut.
It's absolutely fundamental. Before him, yes, thinkers used reason, but Parmenides elevated systematic deductive logic, especially based on non-contradiction, to be the sole arbiter of truth about reality. He wasn't just observing and speculating, he was asking what must be true logically, regardless of appearances.
And it all hinges on that non-contradiction thing. A thing can't be and not be.
He hammers it home. It seems basic, but he shows its profound implications. If not being is contradictory, then anything that relies on not being, like change, starting, stopping, division, movement, must also be contradictory, therefore unreal. He applied that razor-sharp logic to existence itself.
And this way of arguing, this logical rigor, how much did it influence the big names who came later, like Plato and Aristotle?
Massively. It forced everyone after him to confront his arguments. Plato was deeply influenced. His whole theory of forms these perfect, eternal, unchanging concepts that are the true reality, while the physical world is just shadows that resonate strongly with Parmenides' unchanging being. Plato even wrote a dialogue, the Parmenides, where he has Socrates grapple with these very ideas.
And Aristotle? Did he just accept it?
No, Aristotle wanted to save the reality of change, the world we actually observe. But he couldn't just ignore Parmenides. He had to develop his own sophisticated metaphysics, like his ideas of potentiality and actuality, partly as a way to explain change without resorting to the absolute not being that Parmenides had shown to be impossible. You had to wrestle with Parmenides to do metaphysics after him.
Okay, but here's a puzzle. If Parmenides is all about one unchanging being, how come in the doxa section, the path of opinion, he apparently describes a whole cosmology, something about fire and night being the basic elements? That sounds like multiplicity and change right there.
Ah, yes, the famous doxa cosmology. You're right, it seems like a flat-out contradiction, and that's been debated for centuries. In that part of the poem, he does outline a world system seemingly based on two opposing principles: light or fire, hot, bright, rare, and night, cold, dark, dense. Their mixing is said to create everything we see.
But two principles, mixing, creating things, that's exactly what the path of truth says is impossible. How does that work?
It doesn't. And that's the genius of it, according to the most plausible interpretation. Parmenides includes this cosmology precisely because it is wrong. It belongs firmly on the path of opinion. It's an example of the kind of explanation you get if you do trust your senses and ignore the logic of being.
So he's including it as a negative example, like, see, this is the kind of mess you end up with if you don't follow pure reason.
That's the prevailing view, yes. He's likely showing his readers. This is how mortals, guided by their senses, try to explain the world. They posit opposites, change, multiplicity. But look, this whole framework is built on the shaky ground of appearances, the very things my path of truth has proven illusory. It could be a critique of other philosopher systems, or a demonstration of the inherent flaws in any sensory-based cosmology.
That's clever. A bit confusing, maybe, but clever. He's showing the failure of the wrong path to reinforce the necessity of the right path.
Exactly. It's a powerful, if indirect, way to make his case for the superiority of reason. He's showing what happens when mortals wander knowing nothing, two-headed, as he puts it, trying to hold contradictory views based on senses.
Okay, let's zoom out again to that wider pre-Socratic world. You called it a golden age. What defined it?
It was just this incredible period of intellectual ferment, 6th and 5th centuries BCE. The big shift, as we said, was from mythos to logos, from myth to reason. People started looking for natural, rational explanations for the cosmos, not supernatural ones.
And what were the main types of questions they asked?
A lot of them, especially the early ones, were focused on the fundamental substance or principle underlying everything. They were often called physikoi, nature philosophers.
Like Thales saying everything is water.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Thales picked water. Anaximander, his successor, thought it had to be something more fundamental, something indefinite he called the aperon, the boundless. Anaximenes thought it was air, condensing and rarefying.
And Heraclitus, he was different, right? All about change.
Very different. Heraclitus saw constant flux, panta everything flows, as the fundamental reality. He identified fire as a key element representing this change, and the logos as the rational principle governing the flux. Then you had Pythagoras focusing on numbers and mathematics as the key to cosmic order.
So lots of different ideas about the basic stuff or rules of the universe, but all trying to use reason and observation, not myths.
Precisely. That was the big leap. Trying to build coherent systems based on inquiry, even if their science looks rudimentary to us, the method of rational inquiry was revolutionary.
And you mentioned this tension between unity and diversity. How did that play out?
That was a huge underlying theme. How can the world appear so diverse, so full of different things, if it comes from one underlying principle or substance? How do you reconcile the one and the many?
And this is where Parmenides comes crashing in.
Absolutely. Because his answer to the one versus many problem was the most radical. Forget the many. It's an illusion. There is only the one, the single, unchanging being. This put him in direct, stark opposition to someone like Heraclitus, who saw unity within the change and multiplicity.
The ultimate clash. Unchanging unity versus dynamic flux.
It really defined a central debate for centuries. And again, the freedom in a place like Alea was likely crucial for Parmenides to even propose such a seemingly counterintuitive solution.
So what was Parmenides' unique place in all this? You called him a breaking point. How did he break things?
He fundamentally shifted the focus. His predecessors were mostly doing natural philosophy, asking, what is the world made of? Parmenides changed the question to something much more fundamental. What does it mean to be? He moved philosophy onto the ontological plane.
So he basically invented metaphysics as a separate field.
You can absolutely argue that. By focusing purely on the logical requirements of being itself, separate from what we observe, he carved out metaphysics as a distinct domain of inquiry, separate from the study of nature, physis. He challenged the senses, elevated reason, and asked about existence itself.
And that great divide with Heraclitus really highlights this shift.
It does. Heraclitus' everything flows versus Parmenides' nothing changes. It's the ultimate philosophical face-off of the era. Reality as process versus reality as static eternity. Almost every philosopher after had to grapple with that dichotomy.
What about connections to others, Pythagoras and Xenophanes?
There might be Pythagorean influences. The emphasis on abstract thought, maybe mathematical harmony, could have paved the way for Parmenides' non-sensory reality. But Parmenides went much further into pure logic and rejected Pythagoras' idea of a cosmos built from multiple numbers. His being is strictly one.
And Xenophanes, often called his teacher.
Yes, Xenophanes was a major influence. He had already criticized the old myths of human-like gods, arguing for one supreme, non-anthropomorphic, unchanging, divine principle. He used reason to critique traditional religion. Parmenides seems to have taken that rational, critical spirit and applied it even more broadly, not just to gods, but to the very nature of existence. He turns Xenophanes' rational theology into a full-blown, rigorous ontology.
So the whole pre-Socratic period was wrestling with these huge questions. What's the basic stuff? How does change work? How do unity and multiplicity fit together? Senses versus reason?
Those were the core debates, yes. And Parmenides stormed into these debates with his radical answers. The basic stuff is being. Change doesn't work because it's unreal. Multiplicity is unreal. Only unity exists. And reason is the only reliable guide. Senses are deceptive.
He really drew some hard lines, shifting philosophy into this highly abstract logical space.
He absolutely did. And this wasn't happening in a vacuum. The wider culture was also in flux.
Right, the Persian Wars again. How did they feed into this philosophical intensity?
Well, facing that huge external threat really solidified a sense of Greek identity, spurred intense self-reflection. In that atmosphere, fundamental questions, what is real? What can we know? How should we live? Took on even greater urgency. Philosophy became part of figuring out who they were and their place in the cosmos. Parmenides' radical questioning fits into that broader cultural moment of deep reevaluation.
And the colony cities like Alea were the perfect petri dishes for these new ideas.
Exactly. Less tied to old ways, more open to innovation, constantly interacting with different cultures. It provided the necessary freedom for someone like Parmenides to develop and voice ideas that might have been stifled elsewhere.
And crucially, these ideas got written down, right? Not just talked about.
Yes, that's hugely important. While oral discussion was vital, Parmenides wrote his philosophy down in that poem on nature. This allowed his ideas to spread more widely, to be studied carefully, critiqued, preserved. Writing fixes the arguments, allows for deeper engagement across space and time. It was key to his lasting impact.
Okay, so let's talk about that lasting impact, his legacy. He really marks a turning point, doesn't he?
Undeniably, Western thought has a before Parmenides and an after Parmenides. By insisting that reality must conform to logic, even if it defies our senses, he fundamentally changed the questions philosophers asked and the methods they used. He forced the issue of appearance versus reality, senses versus reason, right to the forefront.
And we already touched on his huge influence on Plato and Aristotle.
Immense. Plato's forms are deeply Parmenidean in their unchanging, eternal nature. Aristotle's entire metaphysical system is, in many ways, a response to the challenges Parmenides posed, trying to reconcile logic with the observable reality of change. They couldn't ignore him. They had to build upon or argue against his foundations.
And then there was his student, Zeno, with those mind-bending paradoxes.
Right, Zeno of Elea. His paradoxes, Achilles and the tortoise, the arrow that never moves, weren't just clever puzzles. They were brilliant logical arguments designed to support Parmenides. Zeno tried to show that if you assume motion and multiplicity are real, you end up in absurd logical contradictions.
So Zeno used logic to show that our common sense ideas about motion lead to impossible conclusions.
Exactly. He was defending the master by showing the logical bankruptcy of the opposing view. And those paradoxes have continued to fascinate and challenge thinkers for over 2,000 years, stimulating debates in philosophy, math, even physics.
Do these ancient ideas still echo today? In science, maybe?
They really do. The core questions about the nature of reality, the reliability of observation versus theory, the paradoxes of infinity and continuity raised by Zeno, these still resonate. You find echoes in discussions about space-time, quantum mechanics, where the intuitive picture breaks down, quantum superposition, for instance, where a particle can be in multiple states at once until measured, has a strangely Parmenidean or Zenonian feel, challenging simple notions of being here or being there.
And his emphasis on logic itself.
Hugely influential. His rigorous, deductive method laid important groundwork for analytic philosophy in the 20th century, with its intense focus on logic and language. Parmenides taught philosophy how to argue with logical rigor.
So wrapping this up, Parmenides' big radical idea, reality, being, is one, unchanging, eternal, motionless. The world we see, mostly an illusion, a trick of the senses.
He was the one who really pushed philosophy beyond just asking what's it made of, to asking what does it mean to be. That shift to metaphysics, prioritizing logic over appearance, that was his revolutionary contribution.
Which leaves us, and you the listener, with a pretty mind-bending thought to take away. If reality isn't what our senses tell us, as Parmenides argued, then what is it? And maybe more pointedly for us today. How much of what we take for granted is real? How much of our modern understanding is just our generation's path of opinion? Maybe masking a deeper, stranger truth we haven't grasped yet? What really stands out to you from this journey into Parmenides' world